Picture this. February 3rd, 1947. The port of Copenhagen is frozen solid, ice thick enough to walk on covering the harbor that serves as Denmark's economic lifeline to the recovering world. Captain James Thornton, a 34-year-old British intelligence officer operating under diplomatic cover at the British Embassy, walks through the warehouse district on Nyhavn, conducting what his official schedule lists as routine inspection of British shipping interests. At 19:23 hours, he radios his handler at the embassy, confirming completion of the day's work and estimating arrival back at his flat in 30 minutes. At 19:25 hours, a warehouse watchman hears what sounds like a brief scuffle near Warehouse 47B, a facility supposedly empty since German occupation ended. By 19:30 hours, when Thornton fails to check in as required, British intelligence begins mobilizing search teams. They find his briefcase abandoned 50 meters from the warehouse, its contents scattered across frozen cobblestones as if dropped during flight. But Thornton himself has vanished into Copenhagen's winter night, leaving behind only footprints in fresh snow that lead directly to Warehouse 47B's locked door and then simply stop, as if he'd walked through solid steel. For 78 years, his fate would remain one of the Cold War's earliest mysteries, a disappearance that British, Danish, and Soviet intelligence all investigated and all failed to explain. Until 2025, when demolition crews preparing the warehouse district for luxury redevelopment breach a hidden sublevel that shouldn't exist according to any building plans, finding a sealed room containing equipment that predates the electronic age, documents written in codes no one alive can break, and evidence that Captain James Thornton didn't die on that frozen February night. He discovered something that 3 intelligence services had spent 78 years ensuring stayed buried beneath Copenhagen's harbor. James Thornton wasn't supposed to be in Denmark. His official posting was Moscow, where MI6 had assigned him in late 1945 to monitor Soviet activities as wartime alliance gave way to the suspicion and paranoia that would define the next half-century. But in December 1946, Thornton had been abruptly reassigned to Copenhagen, transferred under circumstances that his personnel file described only as operational necessity requiring immediate redeployment. The file, declassified in 2019 under sustained pressure from historians studying early Cold War intelligence operations, revealed nothing about why Thornton had left Moscow or what his actual mission in Denmark involved. His colleagues at the British Embassy knew him as a competent but unremarkable intelligence officer who spent his days monitoring shipping, interviewing Danish officials about Soviet activities in the Baltic, and filing reports that rarely contained information that headquarters considered valuable. He lived alone in a modest flat near Kongens Nytorv, spoke adequate Danish with a pronounced English accent, and socialized infrequently with other embassy staff. Those who remembered him after his disappearance described a man who seemed distracted, preoccupied with something he never discussed, taking long walks through the city at odd hours without explanation. But Thornton's personal letters, preserved by his sister in England and donated to military archives after her death in 1993, painted a different picture. He'd been writing to Margaret Thornton regularly since his arrival in Copenhagen, letters that carefully avoided any mention of classified work, but which hinted at growing unease about his assignment. In January 1947, just weeks before his disappearance, he'd written words that Margaret would reread obsessively for decades. "Maggie, I've stumbled onto something that doesn't make sense given everything we thought we knew about the war's end. The Germans left more behind than territory and prisoners. There are facilities, installations, projects that continued operating even after surrender. And the Soviets know about them. That's why they're so interested in Denmark, why they're pressuring the Danes to allow access to sites that supposedly have no strategic value. I'm following leads that my superiors either don't believe or don't want to pursue. If something happens to me if I don't write again, contact Colonel Whitmore at MI6 headquarters. Tell him I found proof of Project Nordlicht. He'll understand." Margaret Thornton had indeed contacted Colonel Whitmore after James disappeared. She'd been told that her brother had likely been killed by Soviet agents, that his body would probably never be recovered, and that his work involved classified matters she couldn't be briefed on. The reference to Project Nordlicht was dismissed as meaningless, possibly a code phrase James had invented to mislead anyone reading his mail. Margaret spent the rest of her life convinced that British intelligence knew more than they'd admitted, that James had discovered something significant enough to get him killed, and that his superiors had sacrificed him rather than acknowledge whatever he'd found. The warehouse district where Thornton vanished had been heavily damaged during German occupation, particularly in the war's final months when Allied bombing targeted infrastructure that Germans were using to evacuate personnel and equipment from collapsing fronts. Warehouse 47B had supposedly been empty since 1944, its owner having fled Denmark when collaboration with German authorities became untenable. Post-war surveys listed it as structurally unsound, marked for eventual demolition but considered low priority amid more pressing reconstruction needs. But Danish resistance records, unsealed in the 1990s as part of efforts to document occupation and liberation, contained intriguing references to Warehouse 47B. Several resistance members reported that Germans had used it for storage in late 1944 and early 1945, bringing in crates under heavy guard and conducting operations inside that weren't explained by standard military logistics. One resistance fighter, a dock worker named Søren Jensen, had reported seeing Wehrmacht engineers enter the warehouse in March 1945 with drilling equipment and blueprints, suggesting they were modifying the building's structure rather than simply using it for storage. Jensen's report to resistance leadership had recommended monitoring the warehouse, but by the time action could be coordinated, Germany had surrendered and the building stood empty. Post-liberation searches found nothing unusual, just empty rooms showing signs of hasty evacuation and the normal deterioration from years of war-related neglect. The building was declared abandoned, its contents confiscated or destroyed, and it faded from intelligence interest as more pressing Cold War concerns demanded attention. Thornton's investigation of Warehouse 47B had begun 3 weeks before his disappearance, triggered by information from a Danish source whose identity remained classified even in documents released decades later. According to fragmentary MI6 records, this source had approached Thornton claiming knowledge of German facilities in Copenhagen that continued operating after occupation ended, maintained by individuals whose loyalty wasn't to any government but to projects they believed transcended national politics. The source mentioned Warehouse 47B specifically, describing it as a gateway facility connected to underground networks that Germans had built throughout Scandinavia as part of projects that military historians had never documented. Thornton had conducted preliminary surveillance of the warehouse in late January 1947, observing it from various positions in the harbor district and noting details that his reports described as anomalous. The building showed no signs of occupation, but he'd detected heat signatures suggesting power consumption inconsistent with an abandoned structure. He'd also observed that snow accumulation on the warehouse's roof was uneven, melting in patterns that suggested active heating systems beneath. And most intriguingly, he'd noticed that local residents avoided the area after dark, crossing the street rather than walking past Warehouse 47B, despite it being the most direct route through the district. His report dated January 28, 1947, recommended obtaining authorization to enter the warehouse for detailed inspection. AFY-6 headquarters had responded on February 1st with instructions to exercise extreme caution, noting that unauthorized entry into Danish property could create diplomatic complications. But they'd also indicated that if Thornton could gather additional evidence suggesting significant intelligence value, authorization for official search could be arranged. That response had apparently satisfied Thornton because his next communication, the radio call on February 3rd, had indicated he was completing surveillance work before returning to file a detailed report. What happened in the 25 minutes between that final radio call and Thornton's disappearance would remain mysterious for 78 years. The warehouse watchman who'd heard the scuffle, a 62-year-old named Klaus Petersen, employed by the harbor authority to prevent looting and vandalism, had given testimony to Danish police that evening. He'd heard raised voices speaking what sounded like German, followed by sounds of struggle. then silence. By the time he'd investigated, armed with only a flashlight and whistle, he'd found Thornton's briefcase and the footprints leading to Warehouse 47B, but no other evidence of what had occurred. Danish police and British intelligence conducted immediate searches, breaking into Warehouse 47B within hours of Thornton's disappearance. They'd found empty rooms, evidence of past occupation but nothing current, and no indication of where Thornton might have gone. Bloodhounds tracked his scent to the warehouse's main entrance and then lost it completely, as if he'd vanished into thin air. More extensive searches over the following weeks revealed nothing additional, and by March 1947 the investigation had been suspended, with Thornton officially listed as missing, presumed killed by unknown parties for unknown reasons. But Soviet intelligence's reaction to Thornton's disappearance suggested they knew more than they'd admitted. KGB files declassified in the 1990s after the Soviet Union's collapse revealed that Soviet agents in Copenhagen had been monitoring Thornton for weeks before his disappearance, aware that he was investigating something they described as residual German operations of special concern. The KGB had concluded that Thornton had likely been killed by a German stay-behind network, operatives who'd remained in Denmark after occupation ended to protect projects that predated the war itself. But the Soviets had apparently decided against pursuing the matter, withdrawing their surveillance and filing reports indicating that whatever Thornton had discovered was beyond their capability to investigate safely. For 78 years, Warehouse 47B stood in Copenhagen's harbor district, gradually deteriorating as economic activity shifted to modern port facilities and the historic waterfront transitioned from industrial use to tourist attractions and expensive housing. The building changed ownership multiple times, each new owner considering development then abandoning plans due to structural concerns or financing issues. By 2020, it was one of the last undeveloped properties in an area that had been transformed by gentrification and urban renewal. In 2024, a development company specializing in historic preservation purchased Warehouse 47B and the surrounding block, planning to convert the industrial buildings into luxury apartments and retail space. Initial surveys confirmed the structure was sound enough for renovation, and architectural plans were drawn up respecting the warehouse's historical character while adapting it for modern use. Demolition of interior walls began in January 2025, with contractors expecting routine work preparing the space for reconstruction. On March 7, 2025, exactly 78 years and 1 month after James Thornton's disappearance, a demolition crew breaking through what appeared to be a load-bearing wall struck something unexpected. The wall was hollow, constructed as a false barrier hiding a space beyond that appeared on no building plans. More careful investigation revealed a concealed door, steel-reinforced and bearing Wehrmacht military markings, sealed with locks that had been designed to resist casual discovery but which yielded to modern cutting equipment. When the door was finally opened on March 12, 2025, releasing air that hadn't circulated since 1947, the team found themselves staring into a stairwell descending into darkness, leading to a sublevel that, according to all official records, shouldn't exist. The discovery was immediately reported to Danish authorities, who contacted both British and German embassies given the apparent wartime origin of the concealed space. And within days, as teams descended those stairs with modern equipment and contemporary caution, they began uncovering evidence that Captain James Thornton had indeed found something significant on that frozen February night in 1947. Something that had cost him his life or his freedom, and something that 3 intelligence services had apparently agreed was too dangerous to acknowledge, much less investigate thoroughly. The sealed sublevel beneath Warehouse 47B contained equipment, documents, and mysteries that would challenge every assumption about what had really happened in Copenhagen in the war's final months and the Cold War's opening years. The investigation was about to reveal that some disappearances weren't crimes, but discoveries, that some secrets spanned generations and governments, and that the line between protecting security and concealing truth was thinner and more morally complex than anyone had wanted to acknowledge for nearly 8 decades. The sublevel beneath Warehouse 47B descended 15 meters below Copenhagen's harbor, carved into bedrock that predated the city's medieval foundations. The stairwell was narrow, flanked by walls showing tool marks that modern engineers identified as consistent with 1940s German military construction techniques. But what waited at the bottom challenged every assumption about what German forces had been doing in Copenhagen during the war's final months and what had continued happening after occupation officially ended. The main chamber was approximately 30 meters long and 15 meters wide, its ceiling supported by steel beams bearing Wehrmacht engineering stamps dated January 1945. But unlike typical military construction from that period, this space showed evidence of sophisticated electrical systems, plumbing that connected to sources no city records acknowledged, and ventilation equipment that had apparently functioned for years after the war ended. Most disturbing were power consumption records discovered in a sealed office, showing that electricity had been drawn from Copenhagen's grid through concealed connections until 1952. 7 years after German surrender and 5 years after Thornton's disappearance. The team exploring the sublevel found it divided into distinct functional areas, each revealing layers of the mystery that had consumed Captain James Thornton. The first area appeared to be a communications center containing radio equipment far more sophisticated than standard Wehrmacht field units. Technical analysis revealed that this equipment had been designed for long-range encrypted transmission, capable of reaching stations thousands of kilometers away using frequencies that military authorities hadn't monitored because they believed such technology didn't exist in 1945. But it was the second area that provided the first concrete evidence of Thornton's fate. A small office containing a desk, filing cabinets, and a camp bed showed signs of prolonged occupation by someone who'd been living underground rather than simply working there. On the desk was a typewriter, British-made, with a partially completed report still in its carriage. The report was dated February 17, 1947, 2 weeks after Thornton's disappearance, and began with words that made the investigation team's blood run cold. Day 14 of voluntary confinement. I entered this facility on February 3rd following confrontation with individuals claiming to represent Project Nordlicht continuity operations. Rather than being captured or killed as initial struggles suggested, I was offered a choice. Leave immediately and report finding an empty warehouse, or remain to document what I'd discovered and determine whether it posed legitimate security threat requiring Allied intervention. I chose to remain. That choice has revealed a reality far more complex than my training prepared me to comprehend. Thornton's report, which continued for 47 single-spaced pages found in a folder beside the typewriter, documented his discovery of what he termed a post-national scientific research program that had survived the Third Reich's collapse by deliberately divorcing itself from political loyalty and operating through networks that transcended government control. Project Nordlicht, which Thornton's superiors had dismissed as meaningless code, was real. It had been initiated in 1943 by German scientists who recognized that Germany would lose the war and who wanted to ensure their research survived regardless of which nation ultimately claimed victory. The project's focus, according to documents Thornton had cataloged and annotated, involved what 1940s science called temporal mechanics, theoretical research into whether time could be measured, manipulated, or traversed using technologies that conventional physics suggested were impossible. The research had been conducted at multiple facilities across German-occupied Europe, with Copenhagen serving as a coordination center due to Denmark's relatively stable occupation and its proximity to Sweden, where results could be transmitted to neutral territory if evacuation became necessary. But Thornton's report revealed something that military intelligence, whether British, American, or Soviet, had apparently decided was too dangerous to acknowledge. Project Nordlicht hadn't been exclusively German. It had involved scientists from multiple nations who'd continued collaborating despite their countries being at war, united by belief that certain knowledge transcended national conflict and that preventing scientific progress for political reasons was itself a form of violence against human potential. The names in Thornton's documentation included Germans, certainly, but also Danes, Swedes, Norwegians, and most disturbingly, British and American scientists who'd been officially reported as killed or captured during the war, but who'd apparently faked their deaths to continue research they believed was too important to abandon. The implications were staggering and politically explosive. Scientists from allied nations had effectively defected not to enemy governments, but to an international scientific collective that operated outside any government's authority or control. Thornton's report documented his growing realization that Project Nordlicht represented something unprecedented in modern history, a truly transnational institution that had survived the war by convincing all parties that it posed no threat because it served no nation. The scientists working in the sublevel beneath Warehouse 47B had been there with the knowledge, if not explicit approval, of Danish resistance, British intelligence, Soviet agents, and American military authorities. All had apparently agreed that allowing the research to continue under observation was preferable to either seizing it for exclusive national use or destroying it and losing knowledge that might prove valuable in the emerging Cold War. But Thornton had also documented his doubts about whether this arrangement was sustainable or ethical. February 24, 1947. I've been underground 3 weeks. The scientists here work with dedication bordering on obsession, convinced their research into temporal mechanics will revolutionize human understanding of reality itself. But they've also shown me results that suggest they're succeeding in ways that terrify me. Equipment that appears to slow time's passage within localized fields. Devices that create temporal echoes, allowing observation of past events as if watching recordings. And most disturbing, evidence that consciousness can be preserved outside normal temporal flow, existing in states that challenge every definition of life and death. The implications of this research had apparently convinced Thornton that he faced an impossible choice: report his findings and trigger a multinational race to control technology that could destabilize global security, or remain silent and allow research to continue that might produce results that no nation should possess. His report documented extensive discussions with the project's leaders, scientists from 6 countries who argued that their work was too important to be monopolized by any single nation or suppressed by fear of its implications. The turning point in Thornton's thinking, documented in entries from March 1947, came when he was shown the project's ultimate objective. March 15, 1947. They've told me what they're really trying to accomplish. Not weapons, not military applications. They're attempting to create what they call temporal archives, methods of preserving human knowledge and consciousness outside normal spacetime so that it survives regardless of what catastrophes, nuclear or otherwise, might destroy civilization. They believe the next war will be fought with atomic weapons that could set humanity back millennia or end it entirely. Their work is insurance against that possibility, a way to preserve what we've learned so future civilizations, if any emerge, don't have to rediscover everything from scratch. Thornton's report revealed that he'd found this objective both noble and terrifying. Noble because it represented genuine attempt to protect human knowledge from destruction. Terrifying because the methods required technologies that could be weaponized, that could allow governments to manipulate time itself if they gained exclusive control. His final entries documented his decision to remain in the facility indefinitely, serving as informal liaison between the project and British intelligence, providing updates to handlers he'd contacted through secure channels but never revealing the sublevel's exact location or the full scope of what was being researched. The report ended on April 3, 1947, with an entry that explained why Thornton had never emerged from the warehouse and why his handlers had apparently decided to declare him missing rather than acknowledge his continued existence. My superiors have made their decision. I'm to remain here permanently, officially dead, serving as resident observer to ensure the project doesn't threaten Allied security interests. The Soviets have apparently assigned their own observer. The Americans are considering doing the same. We're creating a strange new institution, a scientific facility jointly monitored by nations that don't officially acknowledge its existence. Perhaps this is what the future looks like. Not governments controlling science, but science operating independently while governments watch nervously from the shadows, hoping knowledge advances without destroying us all. The investigation team found extensive evidence that Thornton had indeed lived in the sublevel for years after his reported disappearance. Personal effects, letters to his sister Margaret that had never been mailed, photographs documenting the facility's gradual transformation from wartime refuge to Cold War research station. And most poignantly, a journal he'd kept until 1951, documenting his growing isolation, his questioning of whether his sacrifice had been necessary, and his eventual acceptance that some choices once made couldn't be unmade regardless of their personal cost. Thornton's final journal entry, dated September 12, 1951, revealed his fate. "I'm being evacuated. The project is closing this facility, moving to a new location that I won't be told about. My 4 years underground have provided the continuity and observation that prevented any single nation from seizing control, but the scientists believe they no longer need resident observers from each country. They've established protocols, gained trust, demonstrated that they can operate independently without threatening security. I'll be given a new identity, relocated somewhere far from intelligence work, and allowed to live out my remaining years in peace with pension provided by funds that officially don't exist. Margaret will never know I survived. My friends will never learn what I discovered. But perhaps that's acceptable price for helping preserve knowledge that might save humanity if civilization destroys itself in the atomic age we're entering." The investigation team stood in that sub-level, reading Thornton's final words, understanding that they'd uncovered not a crime, but a deliberate disappearance, not a murder, but a sacrifice made in service of principles that transcended national loyalty. The question was, what to do with this information 80 years after the events it described, in a world where Cold War tensions had given way to different conflicts and where the technology Thornton had helped protect was either obsolete or had been incorporated into scientific understanding by other means. The Danish government's response, coordinated with British and American intelligence services, was to classify everything related to the sub-level at the highest possible security levels. Public statements acknowledged finding evidence of wartime construction beneath Warehouse 47B, but described it as a standard military bunker of no historical significance. The real contents, the documents, Thornton's reports and journals, even the equipment that still functioned after 78 years, all disappeared into classified storage where few would ever access them. But partial truths were released to address the historical mystery of Thornton's disappearance. In June 2025, British intelligence declassified documents confirming that Captain James Thornton had not been killed in 1947, but had been reassigned to deep cover operations that required his official death. His sister Margaret, who'd died in 1993 still believing James had been murdered, was posthumously vindicated in her belief that authorities had known more than they'd admitted. But the full truth, what James had discovered and why he'd agreed to disappear, remained classified with no timeline for public release. The investigation also revealed that at least 7 other individuals, representing British, American, Soviet, and French intelligence services, had similarly disappeared into Project Nordlicht's monitoring network between 1947 and 1955, when the project had apparently achieved sufficient stability to operate without resident observers. Some had eventually emerged with new identities, living quiet lives while maintaining contact with handlers who ensured they never revealed what they'd witnessed. Others had apparently died while serving their observation duties, their bodies buried in locations that governments had agreed would never be disclosed. But the most significant discovery involved the project itself. The sublevel beneath Warehouse 47B was just one facility in a network that had extended across Europe during the 1940s and 50s. The full scope of Project Nordlicht, its scientific achievements, its current status, and whether it continued operating in some form, all remained classified. But fragmentary evidence suggested that the project had succeeded in its primary objective, creating methods of preserving information and potentially consciousness outside normal temporal constraints, and that these methods had been shared among multiple nations as insurance against civilization-ending conflict. In December 2025, as Warehouse 47B was finally demolished after investigation concluded, a small memorial plaque was installed nearby. The inscription acknowledged that Captain James Thornton, British intelligence officer, had disappeared at this location in 1947 and that he'd given his identity in service of ideals that transcended national interest. But it didn't explain what those ideals were, what he'd discovered, or why 80 years later governments still considered the full truth too sensitive for public knowledge. Margaret Thornton's descendants, notified of the memorial and given partial information about James's fate, responded with mixed emotions: satisfaction that he'd been honored, frustration that so much remained secret, and ultimately acceptance that some stories from the 20th century's conflicts involved complexities that simple narratives of heroism or sacrifice couldn't capture. James Thornton had disappeared into a world where science and espionage intersected in ways that created new categories of service, loyalty, and sacrifice. The sublevel beneath Warehouse 47B was sealed before demolition, its contents removed to classified storage, its existence erased from public record. But those few who knew what had been found there understood that history was more complex than archives acknowledged, that the Cold War had involved not just political and military conflict, but scientific competitions that operated outside normal channels, and that some individuals had made sacrifices that would never be fully recognized because the purposes they'd served remained too sensitive for public understanding. Captain James Thornton had walked into Warehouse 47B on a frozen February night in 1947 and vanished into a world where national loyalty gave way to ideals that transcended borders. He'd spent 4 years underground protecting knowledge that multiple nations wanted but none could safely control alone. And he'd emerged into anonymous existence, carrying secrets that would be buried for 80 years before finally being partially revealed to a world that might still not be ready to understand what Project Nordlicht had achieved or why it had required people like Thornton to sacrifice everything, including their names and histories, to ensure that human knowledge survived regardless of what wars destroyed in the 20th century's turbulent decades. This story was intense, but this one on the right is even more insane. You won't believe what they uncovered, eh?